All right, guys. Tonight we're going to begin looking in more detail at slavery and the slave trade in Virginia. We've briefly mentioned that slaves began appearing in Virginia, but now we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail. So, just to briefly review what we already know, in addition to needing lots of lands, early settlers in Virginia also knew that they would need a lot of workers, a lot of labor, to take care of these tobacco fields. This tobacco economy depended on a lot of labor to be successful. So they unsuccessfully at first tried using Native Americans and indentured servants from England in these tobacco plantations. But these laborers didn't really work out so well because Native Americans often refused to work. Native American men thought farming was the work of women. Also, many of these Native Americans are dying from European diseases, so they're losing their labor very quickly. Also, for these Native Americans, it's really easy for them to run away from these plantations. They knew the land, they knew the woods, they knew the areas surrounding these plantations. So if they wanted to just run off and escape, they could pretty easily do so, as long as they weren't sick or injured or anything like that. And then looking at indentured servants from England, just as a quick review, the way indentured servitude worked, if you paid for an indentured servant to come over from England, you, by contract, would get their labor for a period anywhere between 5 to 12 years. It just, just depended on the contract. As an indentured servant, if you misbehaved or tried to escape, you could be beaten, and you could also have your period of indentured servitude increased. This is also true of indentured females. An indentured servant who was a female, if she got pregnant, she could have years added onto her contract as well. Several issues with indentured servants. Many of them died, just like we saw with Native Americans, although not quite as in drastic numbers. Many also ran away before their indentured period was up. There was also the issue, indentured servants as Englishmen were over time began to become fed up with the situation. We're not going to talk about it too much in this class, but we'll see Bacon's Rebellion was this uprising of indentured servants in Virginia. And this really brings an end to the idea of indentured servants as the main source of labor on these tobacco plantations in Virginia. So no more Native Americans, no more indentured servants. So where is the labor going to come from for these tobacco plantations? Well, it comes from Africa. We see the first slaves coming to Virginia in 1619. They were sold into slavery in Africa and crossed the Atlantic on horribly crowded slave ships through this middle passage. And here's a map that shows how this worked. You can see in orange in Africa, that is the slave coast where many of these slaves were coming from. They were crowded onto ships and brought to the New World. If you can see these percentages on that map, most of these slaves were not going to North America. Most of the slaves, and I'm talking like 95% of the slaves, are going to Brazil and to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations. Now, these are not areas controlled by the English, and they're not areas we're going to get into too much detail on. But we will see a significant number, even though it's only 4%, 5% about. These are a significant number of slaves being taken from Africa through this middle passage to British North America. To give you a sense of what their experience was like, I've got a couple pictures for you to see. On the left, you can see how these Africans were crammed into these slave ships to cross the Atlantic. I've seen estimates that each slave was allotted about 4 square feet on each ship. So you can imagine trying to squeeze yourself into a 4-foot square box for several months of transatlantic crossing. So we're talking about going through the ocean where we might have swells, we might have storms, we're going to be tossing and turning, and you're chained down and you're not able to move for this whole trip. I mean, if you could imagine the worst possible experience, this is getting up there. Issues on these ships included disease and sickness. So sick slaves could be thrown overboard, even while still alive, to prevent the sickness from spreading to the other slaves. If they tried to fight off those controlling the ship, they could be killed or thrown overboard also. I mean, it's just a terrible, it's an absolutely awful experience to be aboard one of these slave ships crossing the Atlantic coming to the New World. At first, when these slaves arrived, or these Africans arrived as slaves, they're treated pretty much like indentured servants. They were able to be freed after a few years. If they became Christians, some of them were freed as well. But we're going to see over time, over the next 40 years or so, that system is going to shift. They're not going to be treated as indentured servants, as African indentured servants. They're going to be treated as chattel slaves. A chattel, you can think like cattle. They are the property of their owners. And that process begins in the 1660s, when Virginia passes the first laws regulating the treatment of Africans. And they are now going to be treated as the property of their owners. They are chattel slaves. So in these laws, Africans were declared slaves for life. You could not be freed by converting to Christianity. You could not be freed after working for a certain number of years. You're freed for life, or declared a slave for life, unless freed by your owner. Also in these laws, it was declared that the child of a slave mother was also a slave. So the child of a slave mother, regardless of who the father was, whether the father was another slave, whether the father was a free African, whether the father was a white male plantation owner, it did not matter. That child was also considered a slave. And also, like I said, Christian baptism no longer meant that you could be freed. So let's look at the number of slaves we're actually going to be seeing in Virginia. By 1700, what's going to happen? The British are going to become more involved in the slave trade. As a result, the number of slaves in Virginia is going to grow pretty rapidly. To give you some perspective, in 1649, about 30 years after the first Africans appeared in Virginia, there are still only 300 Africans in Virginia. So a very small number of slaves in Virginia after the first 30 years. About 30 years later, Africans only make up about 7% of the non-Native American population in 1680. But by 1770, about 40% of the non-Native American population was black. So the numbers of slaves is increasing dramatically. So why are there so many more slaves in Virginia in the 1770s than there was in the 1680s? It starts with the headright system, which we've talked about before. The headright system led to these really large plantations, which needed slave labor for these tobacco fields to produce money. We're also going to see fewer indentured servants are going to be coming to Virginia. One, because more jobs are available in England. England is actually turning the corner in the early 1700s. And also, plantation owners aren't going to want indentured servants anymore. As Englishmen, they're going to be more difficult to work with than these chattel slaves who you own as property. Also, the actual slaves in Virginia are going to be having their own kids now. As time goes on, a slave who has a child, that child becomes a slave now. And when that slave has a child, their child becomes slave also. So over time, the number or the population of slaves is growing. Okay, so this is going to lead us into tonight's response question. So before Virginia changed its laws in the 1660s, a child born to a slave mother took the status of the father. After the law change, the child took the status of the mother. Why do you think this change was made? And this is a tough question. I want you to spend some time thinking about it. I'll read it again. Before Virginia changed its laws in the 1660s, a child born to a slave mother took the status of the father. After the law change, the child took the status of the mother. Why do you think they made this change? Be sure to print off your notes before you come to class tomorrow.